Ethan Holloway was jolted awake by a frantic knocking at his front door. Loud, urgent, relentless. Axel, his loyal dog, erupted into a furious barking fit, his deep growls vibrating through the wooden floorboards. Whoever was outside wasn't just passing through. Ethan swung his legs out of bed, his instincts already on high alert. He pulled on his boots, rubbing the last traces of sleep from his eyes. Maybe it was a neighbor in trouble. Maybe a farm emergency. But the moment he opened the door, he realized it was something far worse. Standing on his porch, bathed in the cold glow of the porch light, were two uniformed officers. One was older, seasoned, his face unreadable, his posture firm. The other was younger, tense, his fingers resting just a little too close to his holster. Behind them, a gleaming white SUV was parked with unnerving precision. The emblem on the side practically glowed under the dim light. Willow Creek Homeowners Association. And there, standing beside it, arms folded across her chest, was Victoria Langley. Her head tilted slightly, that smug, self-satisfied smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't here for a friendly chat. Ethan Holloway? The older officer, Sheriff Thomas Grayson, asked, his voice level, unreadable. The younger one, Officer Caleb Turner, was already scanning the property, his gaze darting between the barn and the livestock pen. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Depends. Who's asking? Sheriff Grayson, County Sheriff's Department, the officer stated. We received a complaint about illegal structures and unauthorized livestock on your property. For a second, Ethan just stared. Then, much to everyone's discomfort, he burst into deep, unrestrained laughter. His shoulders shook, and he had to brace himself against the doorframe. His laughter rich and genuine. Illegal structures? He wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. Sheriff, this barn's been standing longer than you. Real by and every person in this town. And last I checked, having cows and chickens on a farm ain't exactly a crime. Victoria stepped forward sharply, waving a thick stack of papers in the air. This property is under Willow Creek HOA jurisdiction, and you are in clear violation of our community standards, she declared, her voice dripping with forced politeness. Ethan tilted his head as if in deep thought. Noise pollution on a farm? Imagine that. Officer Turner fought back a smirk, but Sheriff Grayson remained stoic. Sir, we need to verify your ownership records. Do you have proof this land belongs to you? Without a word, Ethan turned on his heel and disappeared inside. Moments later, he returned, slamming a thick, dust-covered deed onto the porch railing. Right here. Holloway Acres, privately owned. Not a part of any HOA. Sheriff Grayson studied the document carefully, flipping through the pages. Victoria loomed behind him, her fingers gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. The silence stretched unbearably long before Grayson finally exhaled and nodded. It checks out. Your property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. For the first time, Victoria's composure cracked. Her lips parted, then pressed into a thin line, as if she were struggling to process what had just happened. But he's ruining the neighborhood aesthetic. Ethan grinned, his voice calm. That's not my problem, ma'am. Sheriff Grayson sighed, clearly regretting that he'd gotten dragged into this. Ma'am, if Mr. Holloway isn't part of the HOA, there's nothing we can do. Victoria's face flushed an impressive shade of red. She snapped her papers shut and spun on her heel. You'll regret this, she hissed before storming off. As her SUV roared away, spitting gravel, Ethan watched with an amused shake of his head. Something told him this was just the beginning. Ethan Holloway had seen all kinds of trouble in his life. But this was something new. He figured Victoria Langley's bruised ego wouldn't let their little encounter with the sheriff slide. But he hadn't expected her retaliation to begin so soon. The next morning, as he stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee, his eyes landed on something nailed to his fence. A formal-looking notice, printed on crisp, high-quality paper, stamped with the bold insignia of the Willow Creek HOA. Ethan tore it down, his eyes scanning the contents. Notice of violation. Your property is in breach of community standards, including but not limited to unauthorized structures, barn, non-compliant livestock, cattle and poultry, excessive noise pollution. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines, legal action, and potential enforcement by community authorities. Ethan snorted. Enforcement? Community authorities? What was next, HOA stormtroopers? He crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it onto the porch. The HOA had no jurisdiction over his land, and he had legal proof to back it up. But something in his gut told him Victoria wasn't done. Over the next week, things escalated. His mailbox was flooded with letters, each one more aggressive than the last. Warnings of legal consequences, veiled threats about property seizures, and ridiculous fines that held no legal standing. Then came the black SUV. One evening, as Ethan was out checking the fence line, he spotted it idling near the edge of his property. Two men stood outside it, dressed in crisp uniforms that bore an HOA enforcement. Jury, though Ethan knew they had zero actual authority. They whispered to each other, pointing at the barn, occasionally glancing in his direction. Ethan approached, his boots crunching against the dirt. The men straightened, trying to maintain an air of authority. One stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Holloway? We're with the Willow Creek HOA, Compliance Unit. We're here for an inspection of your property." Ethan crossed his arms, expression unreadable. "You're not stepping foot on my land." The man adjusted his stance, clearly trying to assert control. "We have the authority to." Ethan let out a slow, deliberate whistle. Behind him, his bulls stirred. The ground trembled beneath their shifting weight, their massive forms looming just beyond the fence line. The two men hesitated. "You were saying?" Ethan asked, his voice deceptively calm. The one with the clipboard cleared his throat, clearly debating whether his paycheck was worth a potential run-in with a herd of angry cattle. His partner had already taken a subtle step back. "We'll be in touch." The man stammered before turning on his heel and practically running back to the SUV. The vehicle sped off, leaving behind a thick cloud of dust. Ethan smirked. Yeah, they'd be in touch, but so would he. Ethan Holloway had just finished stacking hay in the barn when he heard the distant wail of sirens. He wiped the sweat from his brow, stepping outside just in time to see a convoy of flashing lights rolling up his driveway. Not one, not two, but three sheriff's vehicles. Axel, his dog, let out a low growl, sensing the tension in the air. Ethan exhaled sharply, already knowing who was behind this stunt. Sure enough, as the squad cars came to a halt, Sheriff Thomas Grayson stepped out first, looking more annoyed than authoritative. Behind him, Officer Caleb Turner and another deputy followed. Scanning the property, Ethan folded his arms. "Sheriff," he greeted evenly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Ethan, I need to ask why my department has received multiple complaints about you running an illegal farming operation." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Let me guess, Victoria Langley?" Grayson didn't confirm it outright, but the slight twitch in his jaw was all Ethan needed. "Look," the sheriff continued, "I know this is ridiculous, but complaints were filed, so I have to follow up. Mind if I take a look around?" Ethan gestured toward his land. "Be my guest. Just mind the livestock. They don't take kindly to trespassers." As Grayson walked the property, Ethan filled him in, the bogus violation notices, the black SUV surveillance, the so-called compliance officers who had tried to intimidate him. Turner, standing nearby, muttered, "HOA's really pushing it this time." Grayson shook his head. "You're telling me." He turned back to Ethan. "Listen, you know I can't enforce HOA rules on non-members, but technically, I have to respond to complaints, no matter how absurd they are." Ethan exhaled. "So what do I do? Sit back while they harass me?" Grayson gave him a knowing look. "No, but let's keep it legal, Ethan." Ethan smirked. Oh, it would be legal. But that didn't mean it wouldn't be messy. Ethan Holloway had a feeling Victoria Langley wasn't done. The sheriff's visit might have stalled her, but it sure as hell hadn't stopped her, and he was right. Early the next morning, just as the sun peeked over the horizon, a small convoy of vehicles rolled up to his property. Ethan set down his coffee, watching as Victoria stepped out of her pristine white SUV, clipboard in hand, flanked by several HOA enforcers. But this time they weren't alone. Two men in work boots carried heavy-duty bolt cutters. Another held what looked suspiciously like a pre-written legal notice. And standing smugly at Victoria's side was Howard Kensington, one of her most loyal cronies, arms crossed like he was overseeing an execution. Ethan didn't move, didn't react. He just stood on his porch waiting. Victoria took a step forward, her heels clicking against the gravel. "Ethan," she called, her voice saccharine but dripping with condescension. "We're here to remove any unauthorized structures and bring your property into compliance." Ethan let out a slow breath, his hands still wrapped around his coffee mug. "That so?" She lifted her clipboard. "According to HOA guidelines, which don't apply to me," Ethan cut in. Her smile thinned. "This eyesore of a barn and your livestock are reducing property values. Since you refuse to comply, the HOA has no choice but to take action." She gestured to the men with the bolt cutters. "Do it." The two men stepped forward. Ethan whistled. The earth trembled. A deep resonant snort echoed from the pasture. Then another, and another. From behind the barn, Ethan's bulls emerged, massive forms moving as one, their heavy hooves pounding the ground. The men froze. Victoria's expression faltered. One of the enforcers muttered, maybe we should—" Ethan whistled again. The bulls charged. The bolt cutters hit the ground. Victoria let out a piercing shriek, dropping her clipboard as she sprinted for her SUV. The enforcers didn't fare. Much better. One tripped. Another practically dove into the back seat. And Kensington? He ran so fast Ethan swore his shoes smoked. The vehicles peeled out, tires kicking up dust as they fled. Ethan smirked. Guess HOA inspections were canceled. Ethan Holloway had barely enjoyed a week of peace before the next attack came. He had expected retaliation after Victoria Langley's humiliating retreat, but what landed in his mailbox made him laugh out loud. A certified letter from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association? Ethan ripped it open and scanned the contents. His amusement quickly turned to frustration. Notice of legal action. The Willow Creek HOA is filing a lawsuit against you for the following violations: harboring dangerous livestock, creating a public nuisance, causing emotional distress to HOA officials, negatively impacting neighborhood property values. Ethan snorted. Emotional distress? He pictured Victoria screaming as she ran from his bulls, and figured that part was probably true. But this was a joke. Still, lawsuits weren't something to ignore. He'd have to fight this. Instead of reacting, Ethan did what he did best. He prepared. The next morning, he drove straight to the county records office. If Victoria wanted a legal battle, he'd make damn sure it was a war. It didn't take long to find her weak spot. Buried under pages of HOA financial reports, Ethan uncovered something interesting. The Community Improvement Fund, a mandatory fee that every HOA member had been paying, had thousands of dollars in missing funds. No repairs, no renovations, no records of where the money went. Ethan smirked. "Victoria, you messed up." 2 days later, he filed his counter-lawsuit. Claim: Willow Creek HOA has engaged in financial misconduct, including the misappropriation of funds and fraudulent assessment fees. By the time Victoria received the notice, the court date was already set. Ethan knew exactly what would happen next. Victoria wasn't just fighting him anymore. She was fighting the law, and this time, she couldn't run. The courtroom was packed. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan Holloway adjusted his collar, glancing across the room where Victoria Langley sat, back stiff, chin raised, dressed like she was attending a country club. Luncheon instead of a legal battle. She was about to lose. Beside her, Jonathan Pierce. Her attorney shuffled through a stack of papers, clearly overconfident. Ethan, however, was calm. He knew exactly how this was going to play out. The judge, an older man with little patience for nonsense, called the session to order. Victoria's lawyer was the first to speak. He stood buttoning his jacket dramatically. "Your Honor, the Willow Creek HOA seeks damages for reckless endangerment, emotional distress, and property devaluation caused by Mr. Holloway's unauthorized farming activities." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Here we go." Pierce continued, his voice theatrical. "Not only has Mr. Holloway refused to comply with the community's reasonable guidelines, but his livestock has also actively terrorized HOA officials, creating a hostile living environment." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, running from bulls will do that to you." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Does the defendant have a response?" Ethan stood, sliding a thick folder onto the judge's bench. "Yes, Your Honor. First, here's my property deed, showing that I am not under HOA jurisdiction." The judge flipped through the pages. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Ethan continued. Second, here's a statement from Sheriff Thomas Grayson, confirming that the HOA has been trespassing on my land, issuing fraudulent citations, and engaging in targeted harassment. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat nervously. And finally, Ethan said smoothly, placing the final document down, a full report on financial misconduct within the HOA, including thousands of dollars in missing funds from the so-called Community Improvement Fund. Victoria's face turned ghost white. The judge exhaled. Mrs. Langley, would you care to explain? Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ethan smiled. Game over. The courtroom was dead silent. Victoria Langley sat frozen, her once perfect composure shattered. Her lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, fidgeted beside her, flipping through documents like he could somehow rewrite reality. But the damage was done. The judge tapped his gavel. Mrs. Langley, I'll ask again. Do you have an explanation for these financial discrepancies? Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came. Her fingers curled into fists, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Ethan Holloway watched, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had spent weeks enduring harassment, fending off bogus violations, threats, and trespassing. Now, he was enjoying the view. The judge sighed. Mr. Holloway, I see no legal standing for the HOA's claims against you. This case is dismissed. He shifted his gaze to Victoria. However, the accusations of financial misconduct and fraudulent enforcement are serious. I will be forwarding these records to the state attorney's office for further investigation. Victoria's face drained of color. Jonathan Pierce muttered, Your Honor, surely. The judge held up a hand. I'm not done. He turned to the court bailiff. Make sure copies of these financial documents are sent to the County Fraud Division immediately. Pierce's confidence vanished. Victoria gripped the table, her knuckles turning white. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creeping across his face. Checkmate. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within 24 hours, the Willow Creek HOA was placed under financial review. News of the investigation spread like wildfire. And suddenly, homeowners started asking questions. Where had their money gone? What had Victoria really been doing with their fees? Within a week, she was forced to step down as HOA president. Within a month, the HOA collapsed entirely. Victoria tried to fight back. She tried to save face to spin the story, but it was too late. Her reputation was ruined. And when the fraud investigation dug deeper, she had no choice. She packed her bags and left town for good. Victoria Langley thought she could control everything. The neighborhood, the HOA, even the law. What she never expected was for her downfall to become an internet sensation. It started with a single video. One of Ethan Holloway's neighbors, Michael Carter, had been watching from his porch the day Victoria and her enforcers ran from the bulls. He had captured everything. The bolt cutters, the arrogance, and then the stampede of fear as HOA members screamed and scattered. The footage was glorious. Victoria's clipboard flying through the air, Howard Kensington tripping over himself, scrambling into an SUV, the HOA's enforcement team diving into their vehicles like they were fleeing a war zone. Michael uploaded the video that evening with the caption, Joe tries to take a farmer's land. It ends badly. Within hours, it exploded. The internet devoured it. Memes flooded social media. A freeze frame of Victoria running, captioned, When you realize the HOA doesn't control bulls. A slow-motion replay of Kensington falling. Labeled HOA Power Move Tactical Retreat. A dramatic music remix that turned the entire event into an action movie trailer. Even local news stations picked up the story, dubbing it the Great HOA Bull Run. Ethan. He couldn't go into town without someone shaking his hand or buying him a drink. Even Sheriff Thomas Grayson cracked a smile when he saw him. Didn't think I'd ever see an HOA get taken down by livestock, he admitted, tipping his hat. Meanwhile, Victoria was drowning in humiliation. Her phone was ringing. Non-stop angry HOA members, demanding refunds for the fees she had stolen. The fraud investigation was closing in, and now she was a laughingstock nationwide. She tried to disappear, but the internet never forgets. Ethan, on the other hand, was finally enjoying his peace. And the best part? The HOA was history. With Victoria Langley gone and the Willow Creek HOA officially dissolved, The town finally felt free. The weight that had been pressing down on the community for years had vanished, replaced by something new: relief, laughter, and a whole lot of celebration. Ethan Holloway decided there was only one way to mark the occasion: a massive barbecue. Word spread fast, and by the time the sun began to set, half the town had shown up. Trucks lined the dirt road leading to Holloway Acres, and the scent of smoked brisket and grilled ribs filled the air. Ethan stood by the pit, flipping steaks, nodding at the familiar faces gathering around. Michael Carter, the man behind the viral HOA takedown video, was grinning ear to ear as people clapped him on the back, thanking him for the best internet gold of the year. Sheriff Thomas Grayson strolled up, grabbing a beer from the cooler. "You really had to go the bull route, huh?" he mused, shaking his head. Ethan smirked. "Figured they needed a proper escort off my land." Grayson chuckled, tipping his hat. "Well, can't argue with results." Across the field, kids ran freely, no longer ushered inside at the sight of an HOA clipboard. The Alvarez family, whose landscaping business had been blacklisted under Victoria's reign, now had contracts lined up for months. The Nakamuras, who had been fined endlessly for their cultural garden, had replanted every last decoration, with the entire town helping them do it. It wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming what was theirs. As the night rolled in, Ethan leaned against his truck, taking in the sight, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the glow of the bonfire reflecting off the barn. Peace, real, earned peace. Then, with a slow, knowing grin, he turned toward the bullpen, where his biggest, meanest bull stood, the very one that had sent Victoria Langley sprinting for her life. He slapped its side and muttered, "Well, Nancy, looks like we won." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Holloway could finally breathe.